everybody. Welcome back to the yet unnamed RFL podcast. It is episode 2. We are back. The holiday season is becoming a distant memory. The new year is upon us soon as we move through the year. But in RFL season, it is still the off season. We are now through the first phase of free agency, and there are some signings that you can probably see on the screen where we're of course going to talk about that today. But the draft is definitely imminent. So as we get into the new year, it's not only going to be a fantastic 2025 for everyone, but we are also going to be entering probably one of the most historic drafts in the RFL ever, I think, possibly, when we get into talking to it. But of course, it's not just me here talking about the draft, free agency, and everything that's going on and everything that could possibly be happening over the coming weeks. I'm joined by Wobbegong. Wobbegong, it's great to have you back on the show. We're back here really to talk about quite a lot of things that have happened this off-season and things that are going to happen, I think.
Yeah, so thanks for having me again. It was very fun to talk about the Bills last week. And yeah, now off-season is here. As said in the last episode, I love the off-season, especially the draft. So I'm really excited for that to happen. And what we want to do today is look at the mock draft that has been posted in the news channel and specifically take a look at the top 10 storylines, picks, positions, take a look at the teams, what their free agency strategy might have told us about the draft. Then after that, also take a look at the free agency, some storylines that we found interesting, some teams that did great moves, and yeah, just preparing ourselves for the big draft that's going to happen soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a historic draft. Anyone who is an NFL fan will know that the 83 draft was just full of some complete and utter Hall of Famers, and we'll of course be talking about them. I think probably fair to say that before we go in and talk about the draft, talk about free agency and how it all merges together in terms of team outlook, we should probably just mention up massive caveat. First of all, we have no idea what the draft scouting looks like, and that has not been put into the game at this point here. So if any projections we make don't come true or they look chaotic, that's probably why. Of course, anyone who's watching this back on the video will see that we go to my scouting draft for the Baltimore Colts. Again, just to caveat, all the scouting stuff in there is obviously not realistic, not fitted in terms of the actual draft. It hasn't been implemented. We are using a file that's to be uploaded, I think, fair to say, Wobbegong. So we'll navigate our way around, but I wouldn't be using this video per se as the actual scouting profile to get yourself some extra information, because it is going to be completely and utterly false. But it doesn't mean that we can't talk about the names, talk about the free agency, and talk about some of the team outlooks that this possibly is going to demonstrate. So, Wobbegong, with that massive caveat put into place, where would you like to start with the scouting and free agency this off-season?
We can jump right into the first overall pick with the Washington Redskins. What I really like about our league is that there is a draft lottery at the beginning. So if you're the worst team, you do not have the first overall pick guaranteed. That hopefully helps us to not tank. But yeah, Washington had the first overall pick and also prepared themselves in free agency with some key signings on offense. On guard, they signed Reggie McKenzie, on tackle Jim Yarbrough, and on wide receiver Ray Jarvis. So you can see their resources is headed into offense. So does that prepare Washington for a quarterback at first overall? What are your thoughts? And what do you think? Who could pick Washington? There's some really big names at quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations to Washington, I think, first and foremost, to landing the number 1 pick. It's probably one of the best number 1 picks you can ever get in an NFL multiplayer league like we have. But yeah, I mean, I think it was fascinating, right? So we put it spot on, essentially. If you look at the three players they signed in free agency, first of all, I think it's worth mentioning they were all 1-year deals. So they're all retrofitted to be the one season and see how they get on, and then I'm guessing tweak and change as you go along. So probably a smart move by the Redskins, given the position they were in last year, to just get a couple of guys in who probably be in a bit of an improvement over what they had last year. And, you know, with the number 1 overall pick, if they do hold it, and we'll probably talk about that later on, but if they do hold it, they are, you know, almost certainly going to land one of the best quarterbacks in the draft class, and possibly one of the best quarterbacks that we might see entering the RFL for a long time. But I mean, I really like the Ray Jarvis pickup. I'll say, first and foremost. I think he's a solid wide receiver. I like Jim Yarbrough, and the guy who I was actually going for with the Baltimore Colts. I thought he would be a solid tackle. He's just a good all-round tackle. And then Reggie McKenzie, again, nice veteran guard to kind of really shore up that offensive line. Yeah, so I think I quite like the smart moves the Redskins have made. And like you said, it kind of points to one thing, right? Which is basically they are almost certainly going to be looking at a quarterback if they hold the number one pick and continue to maintain it. But I mean, I don't know about you, Wobbegong, but do you think this is an indication that the Redskins are going to keep the pick and draft it? Or do you think there's going to just be a huge amount of frantic craziness in terms of trying to land that number one pick and trying to trade for it? Do you think they're going to give in to possibly some of the offers? Or do you think that this might just be the sign that was needed during free agency that actually we're going to hold on, we're going to get some veterans in who can actually play the key positions that we need on offense, and we're going to give this rookie quarterback the opportunity to really demonstrate how elite they are?
I wouldn't be surprised if the Dolphins GM tried to call the Redskins. They have 5 or 6 first round picks, so I think they could make an offer that would be too good to reject. The Dolphins are picking at number 3, so the Redskins would be guaranteed to get one of the 3 QBs. But the question is, do you want to make your own choice and get what you think is the best quarterback of the draft class, or get additional first rounders to then draft a quarterback? And when I look at their roster, they have 48 players at their active roster, so there's maybe not the need for them to make multiple picks, get better at multiple positions. I think quarterback is the main one, and if they can put maybe the best quarterback of this draft into the roster, they should do that. So in my opinion, I would maybe stick at first overall. I don't know what the Dolphins or other teams are offering, of course. But yeah, I wouldn't give up the first overall pick for just 2 first rounders. Would maybe take a third one or another player. So I would be really interested to learn about their phone calls.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, right? Because when you look at the Washington roster, it's not terrible, right? It's not the worst roster, I don't think, that's currently constructed at this moment in time. There are some that still need a huge amount of gaps to be kind of filled. I mean, I obviously, shoring up the offensive line was a priority, I think, and adding some of those players that we mentioned will help. But there's, as you said, they've got 48 players in their roster at the moment, which means they have the depth anyway to kind of run with what they need. I think, for me, it comes down to the question which we are waiting for, which is how do these quarterbacks pan out when we get to scouting? Is there a favourite for Curtins? I mean, I've been with Curtins in multiple multiplayer leagues over multiple years now, and I don't think he has a preference for a type of quarterback. As I'm sure there will be some GMs in our league and others that will take a certain type of quarterback, whether that is a more mobile quarterback, a more gunslinging type quarterback, a more intelligent sort of basic sort of setup kind of guy. I've seen him take all sorts and do well with all sorts, to be perfectly honest with you. So I don't think that's going to be the thing that sways him. I think if I was sitting in his seat, I think it's going to be about, is there something that's just too good to turn down? You mentioned the Dolphins, and obviously the Dolphins moved a huge amount of draft assets last year to kind of really throw it into this draft, really, knowing that this was going to contain some very, very good personnel. If there's something too good for them to turn down, does he take it, or is it a case of when he gets the scouting back, he goes, actually, I've made my mind up, and one of these 3 quarterbacks I definitely want and think he is the best of the 3. And as we all know, talking through your Bills' success, you don't necessarily need the elite quarterback. It's more about how you use them, what you put around them. But I mean, this is the 83 draft. We've got Elway, Mourinho, and Kelly, as you mentioned, who are sort of the ones that I always remember. And it might be one of those just turns his head and does it. And I think he's gearing himself up for the best position, right? In the sense that he signed some free agents that closed a couple of gaps that the Redskins had. And now he doesn't necessarily need to make a move. Doesn't need to make a trade. So, man, it's going to be fun though. I think it's waiting for that first round pick to land. I don't know about you, Wobbegong, but when that timer sort of lands and the draft day is set for this time, I think everyone's going to be frantically excited to see what happens with that number one pick, which you don't always have. Sometimes it's like a lock. This guy's the number one. He's definitely going. No one's going to trade for it. No one's got the assets and capital to do it. But this is just fascinating. We've got teams that have that draft capital. We have teams that are trying to get that draft capital, which we should probably talk about. There are teams frantically under the surface trying to acquire things to make things available. And then we've got just, we don't necessarily know who's going to go number one at this stage. There are so many good players in this draft, and we're only talking about quarterbacks at this stage, and we haven't got onto some of the other position sets, and it's going to be crazy.
It definitely will be. I would be very surprised if there won't be a quarterback first overall. But I mean, the story begins at second overall pick. You're the Baltimore Colts. You know what your strategy would be. Maybe depends also on scouting. But looking at your roster, you have good quarterbacks. There are, of course, older when we look at Joe Theismann. So you could play another year without drafting a quarterback and still could be very elite with him at quarterback. But you could also draft a young quarterback, or what I'm looking at, maybe a trade down spot. So at 7, the 49ers could use a quarterback. At 11, that would be a very big down trade. The Lions could use a quarterback as well. Have you made up your mind yet what you're doing with the second overall pick? Maybe you can give us some indications there. Also looking at your big free agency class where you already filled a lot of holes.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely haven't made my mind up for what I'm doing with pick number 2 yet. I think that's still very much up in the air to kind of work our way through and kind of decide on. I imagine, like others, waiting to see what the class looks like, waiting to see what the scouting looks like, and then deciding what is the right strategy. Of course, even at this early stage, there are offers flying around all over the place, right? It's just going to be one of those drafts, I think, where people are just going to be trying to move their way up to get some of these top players, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I think what's fascinating, right, is if you look at sort of picks 1, 2, and 3, we should probably talk about the Dolphins first, and then sort of maybe have a bit of a recap about those top 3 picks. But I mean, I think the Dolphins are just in this really fascinating position, and we mentioned obviously they've got a lot of draft capital to kind of move up, and I guess when you look at the Dolphins, they're ultimately, I think they're third. Even if they end up staying at pick 3, I think they're going to be picking a quarterback. And I think the question they're going to be asking, which is very different to myself in the Colts GM position and Curtin's in the Redskins position, they're going to be sitting there thinking, do we need to really make the move to get that top quarterback, that elite one, the one that we really want to fit how we're going to play? Because they're in a much different situation to where they are in their strategy and in their rebuild, right? They are very much at the baseline of this is the make or break draft for them. And if you're thinking about this being the make or break draft for the Dolphins, they've cashed in a lot of assets to kind of get to this position. How much of that do they balance versus getting the quarterback and the fit they actually want to build around versus actually trying to get some quality in other positions?
Yeah, they have 25 draft picks this year, 5 picks in the first round, 4 picks in the second round. So there is a lot of draft ammunition to trade up. And also, even if you trade up and you from 3 to 1, maybe you have to spend 2 first rounders, 1 second rounder, maybe something like that. You would still have 3 additional first round picks after the first overall pick. And they already have 36 players on the roster. And if you take a look at them, they're not bad. So they have their cornerstones at linebacker, at cornerback, a really good CB1. They have a really good wide receiver core with 3 players with 80 plus overall, also in speed and hands. So they really have good weapons. So I think they were prepared for this draft already 2 years ahead and just acquired draft capital. And yeah, my prediction is they will trade to first overall and draft Dan Marino, but we don't know that. He would, of course, have a really interesting story with the Dolphins, but still, you can see that they did no free agency acquisitions this year. I'm not surprised by that due to the draft picks. So they are really doing something similar to what the Giants did 2 years ago. They had 5 or 6 first rounders, added really good quality players, and they had a really good season after that. So maybe the Dolphins can repeat the story, and this division won't be any easier next year. So with the Dolphins, 5 first-round picks, maybe a good quarterback, and also you as the Colts, a lot of free agency additions, second overall pick. There will be lots of talent in the division. And the question will be whether you need an elite quarterback to win it or a complete roster. So that will be a very interesting storyline to follow. What the Dolphins are doing, they want to use the first round picks to also put them into the next few years. They cannot sign 25 players. So I'm pretty sure that there will be some trades during the draft.
Yeah, I'll be absolutely amazed if the Dolphins don't make any trades. I'm wondering whether they are trying to find a way. Not I'm wondering whether they're just trying to find a way to hold picks 1 and 3. That would be fascinating, right? And that would completely shake up the draft,
that
right?
could be a case.
That could be fascinating because if they take a quarterback number 1, which they probably would do if they trade up, held on to 3, then 3 could really change the entire layout of the rest of the draft, right? That could really shake things up. I don't know if that's an option or possibility for the Dolphins, but that's a fascinating one to look at. There's one other thing I just want to throw in there before we maybe just round out the top 3 picks and what we think. But the fascinating thing is, I mentioned before we were coming on, that if anyone has followed the NFL since the '83 draft, or gone back and watched it, which I have done in terms of just for prep for this, just to get an idea of like how chaotic it was, how much talent there was in the draft. The fascinating thing I found out was that if we just take a small caveat, right, which is you mentioned that the Dolphins or the Redskins could possibly take Marino number 1, which is very different to the '83 draft. But then that leaves us a really interesting situation from my perspective with the Baltimore Colts, which is the Elway Baltimore Colts thing. And I'm not suggesting I'm going to pick Elway or suggesting anything like that, but if anyone followed the '83 draft, there was this massive back and forth between Elway and the Colts in terms of him being selected, whether he would actually even play in the NFL, whether he'd go play baseball for the Yankees, and being forcing himself out for a trade eventually. Could be fascinating that if the RFL happens, that he ends up on the Colts. It'd just be complete reverse of history, which is just, I think I've never seen that in a multiplayer league where a player has actually been could be drafted by a team that he's actually refused to play for in real life. I mean, that's like, I think it's unheard of. I can't think of another situation where I've seen that happen. I mean, I've seen like things like Kobe Bryant being traded to the Detroit Pistons in a basketball multiplayer league, but obviously, in real life he refused to be traded, but not quite the same in terms of entering the league and refusing to play for certain teams. I've not seen like that happen before, so it's just an interesting caveat, I think. But coming back to the RFL and actually how we're looking at things, obviously we talked about the top 3 picks here. I guess my question I'd ask you, Wobbegong, is, without looking at any scouting and completely put you on the spot here, but what would you have down as your top 3 guys, your top 3 quarterbacks? What order would you have them? And it could just be for nostalgic purposes. It's obviously not going to be based on any scouting, and no, we should absolutely take this as this is going to be the top 3. I mean, in the mock itself, just for everyone's background, we had John Elway going number 1, and then we had sort of the pick being Dan Marino next, and then sort of Jim Kelly. That was the 3 that was prioritised in the draft mock provided by RAS. But what's your views? You happy with that top 3, or would you reorder it?
I could see that happening. So Jim Kelly is the 3 for me, but it's way closer between Dan Marino and John Elway. I could see John Elway going number 1. I maybe also already indicated it in case the Dolphins would trade up to first overall pick. I think they would draft Dan Marino because of real life. So Dan Marino, John Elway, it's really more 1A, 1B, but Jim Kelly is the 3 for me. I also liked what you said with the storyline of the Dolphins maybe having the first and third overall pick, and then another player could go. Or if you, as the Colts, decide to draft someone else, so if John Elway, Dan Marino, and Jim Kelly don't go 1, 2, 3, that could, in my opinion, be the best case scenario for the Chargers, because maybe Eric Dickerson is the first non-quarterback taken, but still, if at pick 4 for the Chargers, if there's still one of the top 3 quarterbacks available, the Chargers don't need one. They have a really good quarterback, but they only have 21 players on the roster. They did not make a single free agency addition, if I saw that correctly. So that could be the spot where every other team in the league tries to get the third best quarterback. Again, I'm looking at the 49ers at 7. I'm looking at the Lions. So if in this case Jim Kelly would be available at 4, the Chargers could trade down, get more draft capital, which would be the best case scenario for them to fill the roster, get quality players in there. But yeah, for me, Dan Marino 1A, then John Elway 1B, Jim Kelly number 3. But that could be really interesting with maybe another player outside of the 3 quarterbacks sneaking into the top 3 of the draft.
Yeah, interesting insight that you shared there. I mean, we've got to go on to the next bit now. You've just completely made me rethink about something else as well. And sorry, I'm going to be mixing a bit of the real life draft here with RFL, but another fascinating thing in the 83 draft was there was a suggestion that I can't remember the name of the Chargers owner at the time, but the Chargers owner was potentially trying to acquire John Elway from the Baltimore Colts. And essentially, there's a suggestion that he used that as leverage to get Dan Foots to re-sign because he was refusing to re-sign with the Chargers, wanted more money, I think, at the time. So, guess who's on the Chargers at the moment? It's Dan Foots. Guess who's number 4 in the pick? It's the Chargers. Guess who doesn't need a quarterback? It's the Chargers. It's just fascinating dynamic coming out, and it's amazing how some of these storylines are starting to weave with this draft. But yeah, no, you're completely right with the Chargers. They don't need a quarterback. They do have Foots, who is an elite quarterback. There's no denying that. He is obviously getting towards the back end of his career at 32. So the question then I think on their mind will be, well, if there's a scenario where they land one of these top quarterbacks, I mean, how much do they really hold off and draft one or move Foots to see if they can get some draft capital back for him? Or as you said, they are short in terms of roster space, in terms of roster players, not roster space. They're short in terms of numbers. How much of that is going to play into the factor? Do they swing it and sort of go, hey guys, one of you can land one of the top quarterbacks in this draft. Just send me your best offer and see if they can fill out this roster to kind of get them back up to the top where they were a little while ago. I mean, it's interesting. I think. Yeah, God, I mean, once those top 3 picks land, the rest of the draft is going to be complete chaos as well, I think, is what we're establishing through this. But, I mean, let's assume the top 3 picks go quarterback, as we're thinking at the moment. Where do you think the Chargers end up going? Because in the mock draft, obviously, Ethan, who's the AI bot that picked the best players available, went Eric Dickerson, and we all know Eric Dickerson is this absolutely amazing running back from history. But Jake's pick was Darrell Green, a cornerback. So in terms of need, they were looking at in terms of where the positions were needed for the Chargers. They went cornerback, best player available, they went running back. Do you think there's another scenario that the Chargers would be possibly looking at in that if that were to happen, or do you think it's safe to say that they might possibly be looking at just taking best available player, moving on? Or maybe trading out if that happens.
Would vote for trading out, as said, to get additional picks to fill the roster. A best player available depends, of course, on scouting. Running back in this league is always a good idea. Eric Dickerson is a really good one, so you wouldn't be wrong with that pick. Other than that, cornerback, I think, could be very important, especially when you look at your second pick. There are a lot of teams between pick 10, pick 20 that need cornerbacks, that are very short on cornerbacks, and elite cornerbacks in this league are scarce. So if you can take a really, really good cornerback at this point, at pick 4, it's a little bit early, maybe overdrafting, but the Chargers could definitely need a cornerback. So I think running back or cornerback makes sense here. Still, I'd vote for a trade down, and they should do everything in their power to get a trade down and get additional players, and also maybe drafting a playmaker. But again, pick 4 could be a little bit too early for one of the best wide receivers in this draft.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting what sort of value pick number 4 could possibly bring, because assuming some of those guys we mentioned are maybe off the board, does that mean that the value of the pick kind of drops? Or, I mean, I don't know. It depends on how the scouting looks, right? I think it's kind of where I've landed on that one. But yeah, oh, man. let's move on. Should we move into sort of the pick 5 territory, which is the Green Bay Packers?
Yeah, what I really like about the Packers that they drafted Jim McMahon 1 year ago, so they don't need a quarterback. He's young, he's 24. He was the second overall pick 1 year ago and had a decent season. Of course, there's still room for improvement, but they won't draft a quarterback and they don't have to. And I don't think that at pick 5, one of those 3 quarterbacks is available. So now you're really into the guessing game because they also made pretty interesting transactions. So no superstar on any position, but more filling holes, getting more wide receivers in starting center in Fred Gillian, linebacker and John Anderson. So decent moves, good starters, no superstar, and they could add a superstar at basically any position. So I'm looking at strong safety, at guard, at wide receiver, at edge. They can go best player available. They don't have to trade down because they already have a decent roster. They could, of course, trade down, but they can also just go best player available and feel great about adding a superstar to this roster.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at Green Bay, obviously they're not going to be looking quarterback. Let me throw a scenario at you. They're pick number 4. All the quarterbacks sort of go 1 to 3. Do they then look at the Chargers and go, "Oh, let's just try and jump up and nab ourselves Dickerson," because they don't have a running back at the moment on the roster, and there's not many elite running backs available in free agency anymore. I think it's more like sort of your general sort of middle of the line sort of starter kind of player that's available now. If I remember the rest of free agency, so do you reckon that they've got enough to possibly look at that move, or do you reckon they would be eyeing that type of move?
That could again be best case scenario for both teams. I did specifically not talk about running back because that's something I wanted to ask you. Because as you said, there is no elite running back available, and that's their biggest need. If they don't get a running back here, I think they could still get one running back in round 2 and one in round 3 and have a decent 1-2 punch, a good backfield where you can play by committee. So that could be an option. But yeah, if you want to call the Chargers and maybe offer your first round pick in addition to a third round pick, they have 2 third rounders, or your fourth round pick, or maybe get also into the future, something like that. The Chargers have an additional pick to fill their roster. They could still get one of the best players, and the Packers secure their running back. So that has to be an option for them. So good call out on your end to have them picking a running back here. But I still think even if you don't draft a running back here, you can still have a good backfield with your second and third round pick.
Yeah, I mean, just to round out the Packers thing, as you mentioned, the free agency signings they made were quite astute ones, I think. I really liked the Henry Marshall pickup. Again, he's an experienced sort of wide receiver. He's gonna give some really improved options out there. Brian Bagshaw, again, another experienced wide receiver, was a good pickup. Shoring up sort of the offensive line with the centre, Fred Quillen, was a good move. And then finally, sort of bringing in sort of John Anderson, middle of the run sort of starting linebacker, I think, was a good thing, bringing him back really as well. So they're moving the right way, right position, right way, moving forward, Green Bay, and in a good position, I think, to possibly add some good quality in the draft. And I think they're just going to be one of these teams that's going to just have to wait and see what happens above them and kind of react to it. But not a bad position to be in at this moment in time.
Yeah, so let's move forward with the next pick, the Falcons. They had a big free agency class, and I specifically liked their addition at wide receiver in Theo Bell and edge rusher Reggie Doss. So they really put themselves up for filling all the holes before the draft. This is another team that could just go best player available. Specifically edge and O-line I have here. Maybe the first O-liner could go at 6, and that's something that Jake picked here as well with Chris Hinton, the tackle from Northwestern. But I think also Bruce Matthews on guard, if he's still available at 6, that should be 2 players that the Atlanta Falcons should look out for. But as said, edge is another need. So Richard Dent as a pick from Tennessee State makes sense as well. I like best player available for them. They have a tough division, but decent free agency additions. Should be another good year for them next year.
Yeah, no, I agree. I really like the pickup of Theo Bell. That was a nice signing for them. They also brought in a bit of depth in terms of their back positions, in terms of the defensive side as well, which I think is going to help them. So, yeah, Falcons are in a good spot. I think they're just gonna. If I was them, I would take the best player available and kind of move on with the rest of the off season, because I think they don't have any massive holes to kind of fill. They've got a lot of depth sitting there. It's going to be about them. Is actually, I think, is kind of working out what they keep moving forward, and what they maybe kind of let go at the wayside, because they are in a good position in terms of just the sheer volume of depth, and some of those signings have maybe pushed out some of the rest of the roster. Whether they can package some of that together to move up, or maybe just acquire some additional future assets, could be an option for them. But yeah, I kind of like the direction of the team, and they're in a good spot in this draft because of the free agency moves, as you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, at 7, we have the San Francisco 49ers. And here I'm really curious about what they're doing. They have a rookie GM here in this league, so I actually don't know what he's planning to do. I called them out a couple of times already today that they could be one of the teams that might be interested in trading up to draft a quarterback. They have 2 on the roster who are fairly young, with Eric Hipple, 25 years old, 80 overall. He was the starter last year and had 23 touchdowns with only 3 interceptions. So a really good year, but you could still be interested in getting your own quarterback. So the GM changed, as said. So that could be interesting for them to get their own quarterback. But also, other than that, they could use a wide receiver number 1. So this could be the spot where the first wide receiver gets picked. Also, another edge rusher. So if the Chargers pick anyone else, the Packers might go Dickerson, or also best player available. Falcons draft an O-liner. You could go with the best edge rusher in the draft, maybe for the San Francisco 49ers, if they can't trade up for a quarterback. So lots of possibilities for them, and it will be very interesting to see if the rookie GM or rookie owner tries to be aggressive in their very first draft, or play it safe and just look what falls to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough position to be in, right? In that you're new GM coming to the league, you don't necessarily want to move every single draft asset you have in the future out to maybe land that one player. You might backfire quite dramatically, given where the team is, in the direction it was. And as you said, the current quarterback crop kind of did pretty well last year, so there's room for improvement to kind of sit there. They're also pretty young, so there is development time possibly still. The actual team itself has picked up sort of 2 free agents in Rob Walters, who's a solid guard, experienced guard, and Bob Moore, a veteran tight end. So they've addressed a couple of position needs. I think it really depends on how much time the new GM is going to need to sort of bed in, to get used to the style of the league, and the change from moving from league to league is sometimes quite drastic. And I think the RFL in particular is one of those that is the hardest to kind of move and shift into, because of the modifiers at play to make it more of a historical style of American football. Sometimes can leave GMs and sort of a bit stumped, really, in terms of strategies maybe in other leagues aren't necessarily transitioned over here completely. So I think I would err on the side of caution of like trading picks to get a quarterback, because I think even if this team landed a quarterback, there's still some other positional needs and other depth pieces that are needed to move the team from where it kind of is to where it needs to be in sort of heading to that playoff direction.
Yeah, for the 49ers, I think if they have an edge rusher or wide receiver, that could be the case to be a contender also in this division. They have the Saints in the division, so that's, of course, a big team that we're going to talk about later again. So it will be tough to go for the crown, but I like the roster, young talent. They had great picks in the last few years with another GM, of course. But yeah, as a new GM, I would play safe. So it would be a good option for them just to go best player available. Maybe not trade your future for that perfect quarterback, but maybe just take a look how your first season goes, and maybe go for a quarterback next year. I heard there's another good one available, but let's see. Let's move forward also with the draft. At pick 8, we have the Dolphins again. We talked about them already, so no need to spend more time on that. At pick 9, Cleveland Browns. I also think this is a pick where we have a clear need. I circled cornerback in red, so they have to pick cornerback. In my opinion, they basically don't have another choice. Of course, they could also pick a cornerback later, but if you look at the division, you have the Oilers in there, the Bengals, the Steelers. You need to be good in pass coverage. So a cornerback would be the perfect choice for them. Maybe they get the second best cornerback in the draft, maybe the first best. But looking at the free agents, they added Dave Pierre, a defensive tackle, Steve Holden, a wide receiver. I really like this pickup, also long term for 3 years. And Bob Swenson, a linebacker. I especially like him as well. He's been a former Bill, a good player for me. So 3 key additions that could be starters for them. But cornerback is still the biggest hole, in my opinion, at the Browns roster.
Yeah, this is the first one in the mock draft that actually had the pundit who picks the best player available and the pundit who picks sort of by position need actually being the same player. So they both selected Albert Lewis, the centre back, cornerback from Grambling State. Both went with slightly different reasons for it, obviously, but kind of similar to your lines, which is the Browns basically need some help there, and it is the biggest position need that this team has. They currently only have 2 cornerbacks. They have McNaughton, who is probably not necessarily starter worthy, I'd argue. 41 tackling, 80 speed, 80 agility. He'll get away with it. He'll be fine. And Poe, who's 78 speed, 49 tackling, 79 agility. So no real standout options there, which kind of means that their defensive secondary is going to be pretty exposed, right? So I think when you look at the rest of the roster, there is some really, really good players there. On offense, they've got plenty of assets there. I mean, you could argue maybe they might want to look at wide receiver, but possibly bringing in Holden has kind of prevented that possibly from happening for this draft. They kind of got a bit of a stopgap solution there that'll be fine for a season. Obviously, you mentioned sort of linebacker pickups. On the edge, they've got plenty of talent there in Betters and Wilkes. And in sort of in the safety positions, they've got some elite talent there. So it is the massive, massive glaring hole that I think talent-wise this team and roster probably needs to be looking at. So yeah, I think I agree with you. I think they're gonna be looking heavily at the cornerback position, heavily looking at some of the players available there. I mean, Albert Lewis is in the mock. I can't see a reason why they wouldn't be looking at others and just saying we'll just take the best one available, the best person for this position, and plug them in, and we run again next season.
It's basically the same story for the New York Jets. In my opinion, corner is the biggest need. The mock draft has strong safety here with both picks. They have a Taylor at strong safety. I think he's good for another year, 30 years old, still on 1-year contract. The Jets are very interesting. Again, same story. Great division. They play the Bills twice, the Colts, the Patriots, the Dolphins, and every one of these teams has or will have a very, very good quarterback and passing game. So adding a cornerback for the Jets could be the key to win the division maybe or get second into the playoffs. So are the Jets maybe, with knowing that the Browns need a cornerback, are the Jets maybe willing to jump the Browns, call the 49ers and say, okay, you're a new GM, you maybe did not trade up for your QB. You have plenty of needs, so you can also take an additional pick at 10. So I'm jumping the Browns, maybe also the Dolphins at 8 and go to 7 to the 49ers and draft the cornerback. Do you expect them to be aggressive to get one of the best cornerbacks, or where do you see the Jets picking?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, the Jets. The mock draft has them basically both of the pundits going with a strong safety, and I can see reasons why for that, because Taylor is sort of getting towards sort of the back end of his career now, and whether there's a question mark as to can he kind of keep up the performance levels the Jets will kind of need in that position. I can certainly see why they went that way. Cornerback. Probably, yeah, possibly. I think, as you mentioned, another team that is in sort of a need of sort of another really good cornerback. They do have Hayes, who I like, who's a very, very good player. If they can lock up another guy, they could really turn it on its head in the division, because they'll really make teams have to think about how they play them offensively, because they will have plenty of elite talent in that defense. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning about the Jets is, draft aside, I think they've had a fantastic free agency so far. Picking up the likes of Lyndon Mitchell for that 1 year deal, and the bargain $90,000. Even if he does decline in training camp, I think he's still going to be an elite running back this year. I really like Lawrence Pillars. I think he's a good pickup. As well as Daryl Lamar, it's a really, really good pickup defensive tackle. So this defensive unit has kind of really, really improved. I haven't even talked about Council Rudolph, who's a nice little addition as well. So when you look at the actual defensive capability of this team, it has massively improved just with free agency, and I can certainly see why they'd be going with that, maybe that cornerback position. The other thing I think they possibly could be looking at might well be possibly looking at tight ends. I think there's probably a need for them to possibly get someone who's a bit more of a more dynamic tight end than what they have. They currently have Barkham, who is solid. He's a solid receiving tight end and blocking tight end. Cosby's solid, but they're not really that elite talent. And I say this on the basis I have no idea if there's any elite tight ends in this draft. I haven't got that far down the list yet in terms of looking. But maybe if there's one available, I could see them possibly looking at that, because that might again completely change their offense dynamically, because they've got a guy then they can probably plug in at the receiver options, they can probably plug in tight end options, they can probably, hopefully if they are an elite tight end, they can plug in terms of the running play as well, and really help Mitchell get those yards and gains that he certainly can, given his elite status. But yeah, honestly, coming back to your question, I think they will probably still be looking at strong safety. I think they'll still be looking at cornerback, as you've mentioned, and I think they'll be happy if they find an elite player in either of those positions.
Yeah, I mean, secondary, you can't be wrong with that. So that will be a very interesting draft. We, of course, don't have the time to go through all picks, but we talked about trade scenarios, good picks, quarterback discussion for the top 10 picks. So I'm really interested to see how that shapes out. For the rest of the episode, we want to take a step back and look at the free agency signings. We already talked about some for the top 10 picks. And maybe let's start with the storyline of running backs. You already mentioned the Jets and their key addition on running back with Lydell Mitchell, who is a really, really good running back. He only signed for $90,000, so that's a great deal for the Jets. But you as well have a couple of really good running back additions. After Chuck Foreman retired for you, you added Franco Harris for $100,000 for 1 year. And also your second running back addition in Wilbur Jackson, 84 overall, another $100,000 for 1 year. So two key running back additions. There were some really good running backs on the market. Every running back signed good deals. Then after the first few running backs went off the market, teams have been a little bit more willing to spend more money on quarterbacks. We have, for example, the Charles Alexander signing from the Bengals. He signed for $500,000 over 4 years. So lots of good running backs. You signed maybe one or two of the best ones. So take me a little bit through that. What was your priorities going into free agency, with also focusing on the running back position?
Yeah, I mean, Baltimore Colts specific view, it was pretty clear that our decline in terms of playoff performance was because, in my opinion, because Brooks got injured. So we had a big drop off in terms of talent from Brooks at running back to our second running back option, which I wanted to address in free agency, basically. Turns out, by free agency 2, we'd addressed that with 2 players. Probably didn't need both of them, but that's just the way it goes sometimes in free agency. You bid for both, and they both sign on the check, and off we go in draft day sports. So, yeah, I'm happy to have acquired both of them. It really gives us an interesting option in terms of that back position. So, looking forward to that. But yeah, no, the running back position more generally, it was fascinating, right? Because if I just go to the transaction screen, as you mentioned, there were some really, really good signings. And I think what I would say is, what's fascinating about the RFL now is I think the running back position, we're starting to see the ending of some of the more golden age of running backs, right? Some of the big names that came out in terms of the drafts at the very beginning or the very start of the RFL starting to get to the end of their career now, and we're seeing 1 or 2 year deals kind of being picked up by those guys as they start those contracts, those big contracts sort of decline off, and they teams are probably a bit more wary of, actually, do we think they're going to give us that 2 or 3 year projection? And you can see that with some of the bids, right? Is that a lot of them sign 1 or 2 year deals, which means that it's going to be interesting to see when the next crop of sort of this golden generation of running backs come along and what they look like and how that's going to play out. But it's created an interesting dynamic nature of how the free agency market has kind of turned out, because we've ended up in a situation where some of them signed quite early, in terms of found some deals, and they were happy to kind of move to those teams. And then, as you said, some of the other guys are kind of being locked up for a little bit longer. Maybe there's a bit of a hope that some of them will develop and sort of maybe get to the position of sort of really being the value for their contract. But there's also a competition angle, right? Is that there's only so many running backs available that have good starting position nature, and then sort of anything below that then becomes this fighting mechanism for teams to try and just get anyone in, basically, to kind of fill that need, and don't want that huge drop off, as I mentioned what we had with the Baltimore Colt. So yeah, fascinating insight. I think I don't know what it's going to play out in terms of the rest of free agency. I'm not sure exactly what's sort of left and available. I think there's sort of this mid pack of, I would say, starter level running backs available now, but no one is really going to move the needle in terms of getting you those big performance numbers that you kind of need to possibly really change the dynamic of your offense.
Yeah, but still good players for running back 2 or 3 available. I think, as you said, most RB1s are off the board, but still there's the draft. Will be also very interesting to see how the running backs shape out in this draft. But yeah, that was, of course, one of the biggest storylines of the free agency so far. What's one of your favorite storylines that you noticed during the first few rounds of free agency?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fun ones that I found, which was fascinating, right, was that we were talking about this before we came on, but it's interesting, a lot of players signing sort of 3, 4, 5 year deals at max, really. That seems to be the sort of ballpark number for, this is the first free agency that we've had with Draft Day Sports 25. Maybe there's a tweaking that's happened there in terms of teams not necessarily, or teams or players not necessarily wanting to bid sort of those long contracts, because there is this threat now of the holdout situation coming into play, which is personnel holding out for more money because they're being underpaid for their overall ability or their numbers they're putting up. Maybe teams are a bit wary of that and saying, actually, if we can offer a guy 7 years, we've got to make sure that we pay him fair market value now, rather than sign someone on a 7-year deal and hope they develop into someone who's well above and beyond the contract value that we've kind of have offered. I think that's one thing I've noticed. But because of that, the interesting thing that I wanted to sort of share and reference was that there was only one 7-year contract that was signed, right? And interesting that it's with Kansas and with a punter. So it was signed by Jeff Gossett, who signed a 7-year, $15,000 deal. Normal sort of money for a punter in this league, just above the league minimum is pretty much there. He's 26 years old, so he's probably going to last the whole length of that contract. And I think in terms of his progression and development, he's been developing over the past couple of years. So I think they might have found a little bit of a bargain there in terms of the punter, because if he can continue to develop some of his kick distance, his kick accuracy, which he has done over the past couple of years, that could be an amazing deal. And it's just interesting that it was the only 7-year deal signed, and it was with a punter, and he's fairly decent age and still developing. Is one that I will keep an eye on over the coming years to see how that plays out.
Yeah, for sure. As you said, many few-year deals, maybe also because of the age. Most teams like to keep their key players and sign them to multi-year extensions, especially if they're young and superstars. Speaking of superstars, there has been a couple of superstar signings. The Saints, for example, signed Jefferson. Also, there has been a really good free agent on free safety who went to the Kansas City Chiefs. Hicks was his name, if I'm not mistaken. So 2 superstars that signed for the teams, especially the Saints, handed out a very high contract for John Jefferson. Deserved, in your opinion, or what's your take on Jefferson?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of Jefferson, he was clearly the best option available at wide receiver in this free agency period, right? So I'm sure he had over half the league bidding for him at the beginning. I think he went for a very, very good price, $203,000. Was Jefferson's going to be taking that one to the bank and enjoying it, but at the same time, anyone who's followed the Saints over the past year or so will know that they are a contending team. They have an unbelievably good defense. That's one of the things that stands out for me about the Saints, particularly last year. And if you now look at adding Jefferson to a very, very good defensive team with a team that probably needed that elite receiving option. They had the likes of Roy Green, who is a good young player who's still developing, but they did need that additional punch in there to really take that look off of Green. And when I saw that signing, post our episode 1 conversation about you and the Bills and how you signed, I can't remember the name of who you signed now. You signed a wide receiver who was an elite wide receiver to basically take the pressure off of your rookie sort of wide receiver, the elite one that you drafted. I think Saints
Alfred Jenkins.
Alfred Jenkins, that's it. So I think the Saints have gone down the exact same route you've gone in terms of that thought process. Is that we need 2 good wide receivers, because if one is having all the attention, it makes it much easier for teams to defend against us. And if we have 2, it makes it more difficult for them to game plan against us in particular. So I'm not surprised they went down that route, and I think it elevates the Saints from they're already a contender, but elevates them from contender to probably being looking at probably Super Bowl or nothing in terms of their lower level now. So yeah, I think it was a fantastic move. Obviously Jefferson got paid a lot of money, but that was expected because of his ratings, the actual free agency market and so on. But yeah, I mean, what were your thoughts on the Jefferson move?
I loved it. I mean, I couldn't pay 200,000. I bid for him as well, but I knew that I would be short. I just cannot afford it with my current cap situation. But of course, half of the league put an offer for Jefferson. He's now the highest paid wide receiver, so congrats for that. But he should be a really good addition. The Saints got a superstar wide receiver one, normally shouldn't hit the market, so no-brainer signing if you can, or if you can afford it with your salary cap. I think you have to put an offer in for him. So great signing for the Saints. Absolute superstar wide receiver. I think everything else you already said. There's not much more to talk about. The other superstar I talked about was Dwight Hicks, the free safety for the Kansas City Chiefs, who signed for the league maximum 150,000 for free safety. I'm also sure that 3 or 4 other teams might have offered the same. He chose the Kansas City Chiefs, who had 16 free agency signings, and together with the Bengals and the Rams, the biggest free agency class of the free agency so far. The Rams actually 1 or 2 players more. The Bengals also had a really deep class to fill their roster. So I think the teams made definitely some franchise-altering moves, and will be interesting to see where their next season is heading.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to go back to the Hicks deal, because this was a fascinating one, right? He's played for them previously. He was drafted by them, and now he's going back to them. That's just an interesting thing as well. But he obviously, I mean, it's not surprising that Hicks signed a maximum deal, right? He is probably one of the best free agents available. He's in a really strong position of need, free safety. A lot of teams need a good free safety. So it's not surprising he got the max deal. I think the interesting thing about this now, playing out into the season and beyond, is he's obviously on a 1-year deal. So do the Chiefs have enough about them that he will commit longer term on that maximum deal? I mean, if he goes back to free agency next year, he's going to get a max again. So I think that's going to be interesting if that one plays out. And fantastic pickup by the Chiefs in that sense, because as you mentioned, there were probably teams that were bidding multiple years maximum salary for him, because it's such a dire position of need, and the free agency market was quite shallow in terms of that position skill. So yeah, not surprised. Again, not surprised Kansas City signed a bunch of players. They had a bunch of depth that needed to be acquired. A couple of things I'll just pick out from them in particular. I really like the Danny Pittman pickup. I think a young wide receiver option, still got room to grow. Again, a 1-year deal, but I think again, if they can lock him down, I think that'll be a smart move by them. And I particularly like the other pickup in terms of Pat Donovan, an experienced tackle, but an elite one in terms of run blocking, so it should help their game there. Moving on to sort of the Bengals you mentioned in terms of their pickups. Franchise altering is probably an understatement for the Bengals, right? In that they brought in some very, very good personnel. We talked about Charles Alexander earlier. I personally really like Jeff Hart as well. I think he's just a really good all-round tackle that's going to help. Ron Baker is again a very, very good guard. So pairing that up with some of their roster at the moment, it's really going to help the likes of De Berg in terms of getting to the levels of performance that we probably saw around the 1980s with him. I think would be a good move for them. So I think the Bengals could be back in business this year. So yeah, not surprised that the sheer volume of signings they made have improved them, because they've been quite smart and savvy with who they have brought in.
Yeah, so especially the Bengals are one of the fewer teams who handed out multi-year contracts. So every player is at least 2 years, most of them 3 or 4 years. The Chiefs, on the other hand, only 1-year deals, except from the punter you already mentioned. And when we look at the Rams, the third big free agency class, most of them 1 or 2 years. So it will be interesting to see what the new GMs decide on which player will be good for the future and what their direction will be. But very interesting first rounds of free agency. Any last storylines or words from your end before we close up the episode?
No, I think that's covers most of the main stories so far. I think we've seen some really interesting moves and interesting signings in free agency, as we've touched on. But I think we're all now at the cusp of the draft, waiting to see what happens now, because as we've talked about quite a lot on this podcast, it is going to be fascinating, interesting, entertaining, but I'm sure it's going to be a complete and utter chaos as well, for all the fun reasons why we love the draft, and given the state of it and what's available and what assets are sort of being shifted around to sort of make moves. It's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to see it happen, to be honest with you, but I'm waiting for the deadline and sort of dates to arrive in terms of scouting and when the draft's going to start, because I think we're going to see a huge pickup in activity at that point.
It will be very fun to follow the draft and also recap that. That's definitely something we will do here again at this podcast, and let us know if during the draft any storylines happened that we of course don't know of because it happened at your GM's office. Will be interesting to get some additional storylines in to follow the draft and then recap it, especially round one. Will be very interesting to see the different strategies, different players, and also how they shape up and with what overall and key abilities they come into this league.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to be back to talk about draft recap and grading teams and seeing what the rest of the offseason looks like. But if anyone has any storylines that sort of go under the radar of close moves, close deals that they want to share with us, please just drop us a line, because we will happily discuss that as part of the dynamic and try to bring about the chaos and give everyone an insight into some of the fun things that do happen in the multiplayer league that don't often hit the front headlines. But yeah, no, Wobbegong, it's been great to have you back on the show. We'll be back next time, absolutely, to talk about a draft recap and the rest of free agency and the off-season to hand.
Perfect. Thank you, and see you next time.